Welcome to your online lecture for Chapter 4, where we'll look at some key points from your textbook on the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The theme of covenant is central in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. By the end, the promises are on the verge of fulfillment. In the Tanakh, or Old Testament, there are two basic types of covenant. First, the promissory. This is a promise made by God which shows the divine plan. For example, God to Abraham, Sarah, and their descendants. The second type is conditional. This is an agreement between two parties where each has obligations. For example, when Jacob and his father-in-law Laban reach a mutual agreement to resolve a conflict. Seen together, the Old Testament and the New Testament is a story about God's promise to be with us always. As we study through the Bible, I invite you to consider this theme in the background. The concept of covenant is also at the heart of the Christian Bible, in which the Old Covenant between God and Israel is contrasted with a new covenant with all humanity, believed to have been established through Jesus. This is symbolized in the Christian community's redesignation of the Tanakh as the Old Testament, or the Old Covenant, and the remainder of its canon as the New Testament, or the New Covenant. So when someone asks, why do you have an Old Testament and a New Testament? What do they refer to? You can say the Old refers to the Old Covenant with Israel, and the New Testament refers to the New Covenant with all people. Some biblical scholars find difficulty with the term old, in that for many of us it has a pejorative meaning. And so some of those biblical scholars prefer to call the Old Testament the First Testament and the New Testament the Second Testament, or the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures. However, those terms also have their problems. Let's shift now to the geography of the ancient Near East and Israel. The primary area of concern is this narrow strip of land at the east end of the Mediterranean Sea. The most ancient name for the area is Canaan. The Bible refers to it as the land of Israel. The Romans referred to it as Palestine. There are four geographical regions: the coastal plain, the Central Highlands, the Jordan Rift Valley, and the Transjordanian Highlands. When we think about size, the distance between the Galilee up north and the Negev Desert in the south is about 300 kilometers, so roughly the distance between Edmonton and Calgary. The distance between the Galilee, the area which Jesus grew up in, and Jerusalem, where Jesus died, is about 150 kilometers, so roughly the distance between Edmonton and Red Deer. Israel could be seen as an important land bridge over which empires would pass. Travelers would journey around the Levant, this crescent-shaped area that stretched from the Persian Gulf all the way around down into Egypt. South of the Levant is the Syrian desert, which would have been difficult and dangerous to also travel through. The key empires of the time would have been the Egyptian to the west, the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Persian empires to the east, and the Greek and Roman empires to the north and west. From the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests of Israel in the 800s and 600s BCE, except during the brief Maccabean period, the land of Israel was under the control of a succession of empires, and this was mainly due to its strategic location. This leads us to our first discussion question, namely, what effects do you think the geography of Israel have on its culture and history? This slide shows a timeline of the history of ancient Israel, beginning with the ancestral period in circa, or approximately, 1750 BCE. The biblical period ends at 63 BCE in the Roman period. Keeping this timeline in mind as we journey through the course will help us to understand the context out of which the stories emerge. Let's turn now to the literary world of Exodus chapters 1 to 18. The narrative tells the story of the enslavement of Jacob's descendants in Egypt, the birth, early career, and commissioning of Moses by God, the confrontation of Moses and Aaron with Pharaoh, and the demand to let my people go, the 10 plagues and the miraculous deliverance of the fleeing Hebrews from Pharaoh at the Red Sea. Throughout the years, there have been cinematic tellings of the Exodus story, whether in the 10 Commandments, or maybe you're familiar with the Prince of Egypt, or more recently, Exodus, God and Kings. In their own ways, the movies depict some of the key themes in the story, in the Bible. If you recall, the formal critic places heavy emphasis on style, form, structure, or technique in literature, seeing these as more important than or even determining the content. When a formal critic looks at the Exodus narrative, that person can see the use of irony throughout the narrative, especially in the portrayal of Pharaoh. It reaches its high point as the real contest is revealed to be between the Pharaoh who's accorded divine status and the Lord. In these chapters, the Lord is portrayed as a divine warrior without equal. This, of course, sets the stage for the holy battles to come in the book of Joshua. We can also see the theme of irony in the character of Moses. Irony is used to enliven the literature with humor, surprise, and mystery. If you recall, traditions criticism is the methodology that seeks to reconstruct the development of individual elements within texts, to find their point of origin, and to trace how they have been adapted as they have been transmitted. When a traditions critic analyzes the Exodus narrative, that person will see in the Song of the Sea, Exodus chapter 15, drawing on the structure and imagery of the Canaanite myth of the god Baal, who destroys the chaotic forces personified as the god Sea in order to reestablish cosmic order after it has been disrupted. In Exodus 15, the Lord shatters Pharaoh's army with the imagery of chaotic waters being overcome. Just as Baal is installed in a palace after his victory, the Lord is established in his sanctuary. Traditions critics would certainly find elements of the Canaanite myth embedded in the Exodus narrative. What's more, the traditions critic would notice the stylistically stair-like parallelism that's evident in the building imagery found also in the Canaanite myth. Adaptation of Canaanite myth is also found in Psalms and the prophetic books. Let's turn now to the historicity of the Exodus narrative. There have been attempts to historically verify some key elements in the Exodus chapter 1 to 18 narrative, particularly the location of the crossing and the location of Mount Sinai. Some proposals are more historically plausible than others. There is strong consensus among knowledgeable historians to date the Exodus from the early 13th century BCE. This rests on comparing the chronology of the Tanakh with archaeological evidence. Your textbook provides a good summary of some of those proposals. What we find in the second part of Exodus, chapters 19 to 50, is just as significant as the first half of the book of Exodus. As the people camp near the holy mountain, Moses ascends and encounters the Lord. He is told to remind the people how the Lord delivered them from the Egyptians and brought them to this place. This is the Sinai covenant, a conditional agreement dependent on allegiance to the Lord and faithfulness to the covenant. This is the heart of the Pentateuch and the entire Tanakh. The stipulations of the covenant given through Moses at Mount Sinai continue from Exodus chapter 20 to the entire book of Leviticus and until Numbers chapter 10. Only with an interruption of the golden calf narrative in Exodus chapters 32 to 34. Exodus concludes with the instructions on building the tabernacle. Leviticus begins with instructions to the Israelites on how to use the tabernacle, which they had just built. This is followed by rules of clean and unclean, which include the laws of slaughter and animals permissible to eat. The Day of Atonement, a ritual, can be found in Leviticus chapter 16, and various moral and ritual laws, sometimes called the Holiness Code, can be found in Leviticus chapters 17 to 26. Your second discussion question invites you to consider Leviticus chapters 18 and 19. The question asks, how might a study of the historical world of these stipulations about sexual relations impact interpretation of the contemporary significance of the guidelines? In other words, if you know something about the history, what does that say about how we can understand these stipulations for today? From chapters 1 to 9 in the book of Numbers, we read of how Israel consolidated itself as a community at Sinai. In chapters 10 to 13, we see how they set out from Sinai to move towards Canaan and spied out the land. Because of unbelief at various points, the Israelites were condemned to wander for 40 years in the desert instead of immediately entering the promised land. Even Moses sins and is told he would not live to enter the land. At the end of Numbers, Israel moves from Kadesh in western Syria to the plains of Moab opposite Jericho, ready to enter the promised land. The book of Deuteronomy is a farewell address of Moses to the people of Israel as they stand ready to cross over the Jordan River and enter the land of Canaan. This speech includes the three elements of historical review, advice for the future, and concern for succession. To the speech are added two poems, Deuteronomy chapter 32 to 33, and a historical conclusion, which you find in Deuteronomy chapters 31 and 34, which links the entire Pentateuch to the subsequent narrative. The speech is divided by three separate introductions. There are some theories which attempt to explain the structure. For example, it updates and parallels the book of Exodus, and that it reflects the structure of a suzerainty treaty, where the suzerain protects the vassal. Deuteronomy has a ceremonial style, reflecting the scribes of the 8th to the 7th century BCE, and it also contains the Shema, which you find in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. Deuteronomy clearly expresses the Israelite traditions and laws, which tend to be egalitarian and humanitarian in outlook. For example, the notion of tithing, which you find in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 28, and a limited monarchy, which you find in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 to 20. I invite you to take a moment to look up Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9. This Shema is prayed by devout Jews each and every single day. Certainly at the time of Jesus, devout Jews would have also said this prayer, including Jesus himself. This leads us to our third discussion question for chapter 4. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 9, called the Shema, is the first of several verses from the Tanakh repeated twice daily in traditional Jewish worship. What do you suppose makes this verse so central? Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 5, along with Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, was cited by Jesus of Nazareth as central to the Torah, which we find in the Gospel according to Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 31.